The moment I understood that my son had been lying to me, for nearly a year I was standing in my own kitchen, holding a casserole dish I had spent 2 hours preparing, and nobody in the next room even knew I was there. That was Christmas Eve. The house smelled like pine and cinnamon. Carols played softly from somewhere down the hall, and I stood at the kitchen threshold, watching my son Walter laugh at something his wife Nadine said, watching my son-in-law talk about ski trips and stock portfolios, watching my grandchildren scroll through their phones. And I realized with a quiet, terrible clarity that I had not been invited into this gathering. I had simply shown up to it, the way furniture shows up, the way a lamp shows up, present, useful once and largely forgotten. I did not make a scene, I never do. Instead, I set the casserole on the counter, picked up my coat from the rack near the back door, and walked out into the cold December night, without saying goodbye to a single person. Nobody came after me. Nobody called for 47 minutes. And what they didn't know, what none of them had any idea about, was that before that night ended, I would find out exactly what my son had been doing behind my back. And once I found out, there would be no going back for any of us. If you've ever felt like a visitor in your own family's life, I'd love for you to stay with me through this story. Please like and subscribe if stories like this speak to something you recognize. And tell me where you're watching from tonight. Sometimes knowing someone else is out there listening is the only comfort that makes sense. My husband Leonard died 22 months before that Christmas. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 4 months, which is both a mercy and a cruelty, depending on which part of those 4 months you're describing. We had been married for 38 years. We met at a church potluck in Raleigh, North Carolina, when I was 26 and he was 31, and he asked me if I had made the sweet potato pie, and I said yes, and he said it was the best thing he had ever eaten. And I said he was a liar, and he laughed and said he had never been less dishonest in his life. We were engaged 4 months later, married the following spring. Leonard was a structural engineer who built things that outlasted him: bridges, overpasses, parking structures. He used to say that the best work a person could do was work that still stood long after the person was gone. I think about that now, more than I used to. We had one child, Walter. He came late in our marriage, which made us perhaps more devoted to him than was entirely healthy. We poured everything into that boy. Private school, music lessons, summer programs, college, graduate school. Leonard worked overtime for years so Walter could graduate without debt. I went back to work part-time when Walter was 12, so we could start saving for it. We never took the trip to Portugal we had been planning. We never bought the lake house Leonard had circled in a real estate magazine and kept in his nightstand drawer for a decade. We chose Walter first every time without hesitation, because that is what parents do. Walter grew up kind and smart, and a little distant in the way that ambitious people sometimes become. He married Nadine Collier when he was 34. Nadine was a pharmaceutical sales manager from Charlotte, sharp and well-dressed and never entirely warm, though I spent years convincing myself I was simply misreading her. They settled in Atlanta and had 2 children. My grandchildren, Theo, who was 14 at the time of that Christmas, and Lily, who was 11. Both of them, good kids underneath the technology. Both of them inheritors of something better than what their parents were becoming. After Leonard died, I expected the kind of grief that changes shape over time, that begins as drowning and eventually becomes something you can swim in. What I did not expect was the loneliness that came not from losing Leonard but from losing the version of my family that had existed around him. Leonard had been the connective tissue. He called Walter every Sunday. He remembered Theo's baseball games and Lily's recitals. He was the one who insisted on Christmas together and summer visits and birthday dinners. Without him, those things didn't disappear overnight. They just slowly stopped being scheduled. The first Christmas after Leonard died, Walter and Nadine came to Raleigh. It was stiff and sad, and we cried together, and that was appropriate. The second Christmas, they invited me to Atlanta. I drove down, stayed in the guest room, helped cook, tried not to feel like a houseguest in my son's home. By the third Christmas, the one I'm telling you about now, something had shifted that I could feel but not yet name. Walter's calls had grown shorter. Questions about my health, my finances, my plans had grown more frequent. Nadine had started asking about the Raleigh house specifically. how big the lot was, whether I found it difficult to maintain, whether I had thought about something smaller. I found those questions uncomfortable but not alarming. Not yet. Looking back, I can see the pattern. I simply wasn't looking in the right direction. That December, I drove to Atlanta 2 days before Christmas, the same as always. My car was packed with gifts and food. I had made Leonard's mother's rum cake, the one I had been making for 30 years, the one Theo used to ask for by name when he was small. I had wrapped every present in the same paper I had been using for a decade, a deep burgundy with gold stars, because Leonard had loved it and I saw no reason to change. When I arrived, Walter helped carry things inside. He was warm enough, distracted but warm. The house looked beautiful. Nadine had decorated it professionally. It always looked professional, perfectly arranged in a way that felt slightly like a hotel rather than a home. Everything coordinated. Nothing personal enough to leave a mark. That evening, the 4 of us had dinner together. Walter talked about a project at work. Nadine talked about a conference she was attending in January. Theo showed me something on his phone I didn't understand, but laughed at anyway. Lily sat close to me at the table and told me about a book she was reading, a long, detailed account of a fantasy world. And I listened to every word, because Lily talking to me like that was one of the genuine pleasures of my life. I went to bed that night feeling cautiously hopeful. I should have paid more attention to the conversation I half heard through the guest room wall. I was not trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. I had gotten up to get a glass of water, and the hallway was dark, and Walter and Nadine's voices were coming from their bedroom, and the words simply reached me before I could move away from them. Nadine's voice first. I don't think she's going to agree on her own. Then Walter. She will. We just have to be patient. Nadine again, lower. We don't have time to be patient. The rate alone is killing us. I stood very still in the hallway. Walter said something I couldn't quite hear. Then Nadine. Once it's handled, we're fine. But it has to be before spring. I walked back to the guest room. I poured the water. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I thought about what had to be handled before spring. I told myself I was probably misunderstanding. I told myself there were 100 things they could have been discussing. I told myself that I was a woman still raw from grief, who was looking for trouble where there might not be any. I almost convinced myself. Christmas Eve arrived bright and cold. Walter's in-laws came over, Nadine's parents, a brother named Greg and his girlfriend, some neighbors, maybe 15 people total. I had been cooking since morning, and nobody had asked me to. That was the thing I kept thinking about even then. Nobody had asked me to bring anything or prepare anything. I simply did it. Because I always had. Because showing up with food was the only language of love I had ever fully trusted. By early afternoon, the house was loud and full. I moved through it carefully, refilling things, clearing plates, finding small ways to be useful. I noticed that every time I approached a cluster of conversation, it shifted. Not dramatically. Just slightly, the way water moves around a stone. I told myself it was my imagination. I kept moving. It was Lily who unraveled it. She came and found me in the kitchen around 3 o'clock, when I was slicing the rum cake. She looked at me with those serious dark eyes she'd had since she was an infant, and she said, "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." She hesitated. "Are you going to move?" I looked at her. "Move where?" She chewed her lip. "I heard Mom talking to Aunt Greg about a place. She said you'd probably like it there, but she also said you didn't know about it yet." The rum cake knife went still in my hand. "What kind of place?" Lily looked uncomfortable in the way children look when they realize they have said something they shouldn't have. "Like an apartment thing," she said. "For older people. With activities and stuff." I set the knife down. I smiled at Lily because she did not deserve to carry whatever was happening in this house, and I was not about to let her. I said, "I'm sure your mom is just being thoughtful. Don't worry about it." Lily didn't look convinced. Neither was I. I finished slicing the cake. I carried it to the table. I smiled at everyone who looked at me, and I felt something forming beneath the surface of my composure, something cold and clear, the way ice forms at the edges of a lake before the center gives way. An hour later, I slipped away from the living room. Not dramatically. I simply stepped into the hallway and then into Walter's home office. I'm not sure what I was looking for exactly. I only knew that something was wrong. that it had been wrong for some time, and that the answers were probably somewhere nearby. The office was tight. Walter kept things organized, in a way that always faintly resembled Leonard, which sometimes made me love him more than I could say. There was a folder on the desk. Thick. Labeled with the address of my home in Raleigh. I picked it up. Inside were printouts, property assessment, comparative market analysis, a letter from a real estate broker I had never heard of, a document I recognized as a power of attorney template, with my name already typed into the appropriate fields, unsigned, but typed, already typed. I stood in Walter's office on Christmas Eve, with a power of attorney bearing my name that I had never seen, had never agreed to, had never been asked about. And my hands were perfectly steady. I remember being surprised by that. I remember thinking, this is the thing that was supposed to break me. And instead I feel very, very calm. I put the folder back exactly as I had found it. I walked back to the living room. I took a small plate of food I didn't eat. I talked to people whose names I can barely remember now. I watched Walter across the room. This person I had loved without condition since before he drew his first breath, and I searched his face for something that looked like the boy I had raised. I found him. He was still in there. That was perhaps the hardest part. Around 8 o'clock, I excused myself quietly, said I was feeling a headache coming on, and went to the guest room. I lay on top of the covers fully dressed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Leonard's voice in my memory. He always said, "Sylvia, the worst mistakes people make are the ones they make in a hurry. Don't let anyone rush you into anything." He had said that about everything. Contract negotiations, car purchases, arguments. Don't let anyone rush you into anything. I got up, put on my coat and shoes, picked up my purse, and walked quietly through the house to the back door. I stepped outside into the cold night. I sat in my car in the driveway for a full minute. Nobody opened the back door. Nobody noticed. I started the engine and drove away from my son's house in Atlanta, Georgia on Christmas Eve, and it was 47 minutes before my phone rang. I know because I watched the clock. I did not go back to Raleigh, not that night. Instead, I drove 20 minutes to a hotel near Buckhead that I remembered from a conference Leonard and I had attended there years ago. I checked in under my own name with my own credit card, and I sat on the edge of a hotel bed that smelled like clean linen. And I did something I had not allowed myself to do in 22 months. I called Leonard's attorney. His name was Franklin Okafor. He had been Leonard's personal attorney for 11 years. He had handled Leonard's estate after the funeral. He was one of the few people in the world I trusted completely and without reservation. I called him at 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve, and he answered on the second ring. "Sylvia." His voice was low and careful. "What happened?" I told him everything. The overheard conversation. Lily's words about the apartment. The folder. The power of attorney with my name already typed. Franklin was quiet for a long time after I finished. Long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. Then he said, "I was hoping this wouldn't happen." My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" He paused again, in the way attorneys pause when they are choosing their words with precision. "Sylvia, Leonard came to me about 3 years before he died. He made some arrangements. He said he hoped you would never need them, but that he wanted them in place." I closed my eyes. "What arrangements?" "He asked me to gather everything you'll need. He left a letter with me. He said to give it to you if you ever called me sounding the way you sound right now." I pressed my hand flat against the hotel bedspread. Leonard had known. Not specifically, not exactly, but he had seen enough, worried enough, loved me enough to prepare for this possibility before he could no longer be there to protect me himself. Franklin said, "I can be in Atlanta by 10 tomorrow morning." It was Christmas. I started to say so. He said, "Sylvia, that doesn't matter. Get some sleep." I didn't sleep much. But when I did, I dreamed about Leonard standing at a kitchen window, the way he used to stand on Sunday mornings, watching the yard, drinking coffee, unhurried and content. In the dream, he turned around and said, "I already handled it. Stop worrying." I woke up at 5:30 with my mind completely clear. Franklin arrived at the hotel at 10 the next morning, carrying a leather briefcase I recognized from Leonard's funeral. He set it on the small round table near the window, opened it, and removed a sealed envelope. Across the front, in Leonard's handwriting, were 4 words. "For Sylvia, use this." I recognized his handwriting in the way you only recognize handwriting. when you have loved it for decades, when it has appeared on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the margins of books and notes slipped under hotel room doors during the early years. His particular capital F, slightly tilted. The way he crossed his T's with a short, swift stroke like he was always in a mild hurry. I held the envelope for a moment without opening it. Franklin waited. I opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten on the legal pad paper. Leonard favored, yellow, wide-ruled, slightly creased where it had been folded. He wrote, "My dearest Sylvia, if Franklin has given you this letter, then something has happened that I worried about and hoped would not. I want to begin by telling you that none of it is your fault. You have always loved our family more generously than was probably wise. That is one of the things I fell in love with. But generosity without protection is an invitation, and I should have talked to you about this directly, instead of doing it quietly and hoping it would never become necessary." I had to stop reading. I pressed my fingers to my mouth and sat very still for a moment. Franklin looked out the window and gave me privacy. I kept reading. Leonard wrote that in the last years before his diagnosis, he had noticed Walter asking questions that were more detailed than they needed to be. Questions about the Raleigh house, about investment accounts, about what Sylvia would need in retirement, as though need were a calculation someone else could make on her behalf. He wrote that he had not confronted Walter directly because he had hoped it was simply anxiety, a son worrying about an aging parent in a clumsy way. But he had made arrangements just in case. The next paragraph changed everything. He wrote, "The house is yours, Sylvia, fully and entirely. I transferred it into your name alone 4 years ago. No one can sell it, leverage it, or transfer it without your direct and uncoerced consent, and I have structured additional protections with Franklin to ensure that any attempt to do so triggers a legal review. I have also established a separate account in your name only, which Franklin will explain. You are not dependent on Walter's goodwill. You never were. You never should be. Protect your peace. Protect the life we built. I love you beyond what any sentence can carry." By the time I reached his signature, I was crying, not dramatically. Just the steady, quiet tears of someone who had been holding something heavy for a very long time, and had finally been told it was all right to set it down. Franklin handed me a tissue. He did not say anything. Some moments do not improve with commentary. After a few minutes, he opened another section of the briefcase and began explaining. The house in Raleigh was solely in my name. The investment accounts Leonard had established were protected from third-party access. Any legal document requiring my signature would trigger a notification to Franklin's office as a safeguard. Leonard had thought of things I never would have thought to think of. I asked, "Franklin, did you know things were heading this direction?" He was careful. Leonard had concerns. That's why he came to me when he did. I looked at the letter resting on the table. 38 years. Even at the end, when he was sick and frightened, he was still building something meant to last. My phone had been buzzing steadily since around 9 that morning. Walter, Nadine, Walter again. I had let all of it go to voicemail. Finally, around noon, a text from Walter arrived that I read and did not respond to. "Mom, we're worried. Please call us. We just want to talk." Worried. The word sat in my mind the way a small stone sits at the bottom of a glass of water, visible but not rising. 20 minutes later, another text. This one from Nadine. "Sylvia, there are some things we should discuss. The paperwork situation needs to be addressed." Paperwork situation. Not where are you? Not are you safe? Paperwork situation. I showed it to Franklin without saying anything. He read it, set the phone down, and said, "Take a screenshot." I did. Another text arrived from Walter that afternoon. "Mom, please. This isn't what it looks like." I turned the phone face down on the table. It was Lily who called that evening. Her voice when I answered was thin with worry in the way a child's voice gets when they are frightened by something they cannot quite identify. "Grandma." She said it like a breath she'd been holding. "Hi, sweetheart. Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm okay. I'm safe." A long pause. Then very quietly, "Daddy and Mom have been arguing all day." I kept my voice neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that." Lily hesitated. "It's about you." She paused again. "And something about a document they can't find." I glanced at Franklin. He had heard. His expression remained professionally neutral. I said, "Lily, I want you to know that whatever is happening between the grown-ups is not your fault and not your problem." She was quiet. Then, "I know, but..." Another pause. "I recorded something. By accident. Like when you accidentally hit the video button and don't notice for a while." My pulse shifted. "What did you record, sweetheart?" She described it carefully the way detail-oriented children do. She had been making a video for a school project in the hallway near her father's office. She hadn't realized the recording was still running. She had captured maybe 8 or 9 minutes of a conversation happening inside the office. She had listened to part of it. She had stopped because it made her feel bad. "What did they say?" She said, "There was a man I didn't recognize. And Dad. And they were talking about your house. And the man said something like, 'Once the transfer is executed, she won't have grounds to contest it.' And then Dad said, 'She trusts me. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her.'" I said nothing for several seconds. Franklin was very still across the table. Lily said, "Grandma, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hear it." "Lily," I said, "you did nothing wrong. Absolutely nothing wrong. Can you send me that video?" She said yes. She sent it 10 minutes later. Franklin and I watched it together on my phone, the volume low, leaning close. The recording was unsteady. Half of it pointed at the carpet, but the audio was clear enough. I recognized Walter's voice immediately. The other man's voice was unfamiliar to me, though Franklin's expression shifted when he heard it. I looked at him. "You know who that is?" He nodded slowly. "I have some suspicions. I'll look into it." We listened to the rest. The conversation was not what a crime drama would call a smoking gun. It was not villainous in a cinematic way. It was worse than that. It was ordinary. Two people discussing logistics, timing strategy. My name came up the way a line item comes up in a budget meeting. Her signature here, her agreement there. The property clears once she's transitioned. Transitioned. Not chosen to move. Not decided. Transitioned. As though I were a problem in a pipeline rather than a person in a family. When the video ended, I sat quietly for a moment. Then I made several phone calls in quick succession. My bank. My insurance company. An estate planning attorney Franklin recommended. One by one I reviewed, confirmed, and where necessary reinforced every protection Leonard had built. By the time I was done, it was nearly dark outside. The Atlanta skyline was visible through the hotel window, all glass and winter light. I thought about the Christmas Eves of my life. The early ones, small and careful when money was tight. The middle ones, full of children's noise and wrapping paper and Leonard's laugh. The ones after Walter left home, quieter but still whole. And this one. This strange Christmas, sitting in a hotel room discovering the shape of a thing I had not wanted to see. Franklin closed his briefcase. He said, "What would you like to do next?" I thought about it for a long moment. "I want to meet with Walter," I said. "Here, on neutral ground. With you present." He nodded. "When?" "As soon as possible." We arranged it for the following afternoon. Franklin contacted Walter directly, which I understood would signal to Walter that things had changed in ways he had not anticipated. I was right. Walter called me within 20 minutes of Franklin's message. This time I answered. He said, "Mom." His voice sounded strange, compressed, like a person trying to sound calm while standing on uncertain ground. "Walter." A pause. "Whatever Franklin told you, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I said. "I'll hear it tomorrow." I ended the call. Gently. Not dramatically. And then I sat in the quiet of the hotel room and did something I had not done since the weeks after Leonard's funeral. I prayed. Not for anything specific. Just the way you talk to someone when you miss them and don't have any other way to reach them. The following afternoon, Walter arrived at the hotel conference room. Franklin had arranged. He was alone. I had asked that Nadine not be present for this conversation, and to his credit, Walter had honored that. He looked tired, smaller than usual, like a person who had spent the night rehearsing arguments and was no longer sure they were good enough. Franklin sat to my left. I had brought nothing but the envelope Leonard had written. I set it on the table between us. Walter looked at it and then at me. I said, "Do you recognize the handwriting?" He looked for a long moment. His jaw shifted. Then he said quietly, "That's Dad's, yes." He looked at me. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "Walter, I have some questions and I need you to tell me the truth, not what you rehearsed." "The truth," he nodded once. "How long have you been planning to sell the Raleigh house?" He closed his eyes briefly. Then he said, About 8 months. 8 months. While I had been calling him on Sundays, sending Lily's birthday present 3 weeks early, driving 4 hours to Atlanta for Christmas. Did you ever plan to ask me? Another pause. Eventually. When the details were settled, I looked at him. Walter, it's my house, he said. I know, and his voice broke very slightly on those 2 words in a way that surprised me, and for a moment I saw him at 9 years old watching his father put a bandage on his knee and telling him it would feel better soon. Love and grief are not opposites. I have learned that, I said. Tell me about the debt. His face changed. I watched him decide whether to deny it. He must have seen something in my expression that made denial feel pointless. He exhaled slowly and then he told me. The debt was Nadine's primarily. A failed business venture from 3 years earlier, a situation he had been managing in silence because he was ashamed, and because Nadine had asked him to handle it quietly. The second mortgage on the Atlanta house had been Nadine's idea. Selling my house in Raleigh had been framed to him as the final step, the way to clear everything and start clean. Someone had introduced them to a man who handled these kinds of transitions. Walter's word, who had suggested the power of attorney as the cleanest approach. I said, that man is a predator who targets families in financial distress. Walter stared at the table. He preys on the desperation of people who love each other and have stopped talking honestly. Walter said nothing. I said, and you let him into our family. When Walter finally looked up, his eyes were wet. He said, I didn't know how bad it had gotten. And then by the time I did know, I was already in it, and I couldn't see a way out that didn't feel like I was failing everyone. I looked at my son. This man who had once been a boy who brought me dandelions from the backyard and believed without question that I could fix anything that was broken. I said, why didn't you come to me? He shook his head. Because you've already given us everything, you and Dad both. I couldn't ask for more. That sentence landed somewhere painful because I understood it. Not the choice he had made, but the feeling underneath it. The terrible arithmetic of someone who has received so much that they cannot bear to ask for more, and instead does something they know is wrong because asking feels impossible. That is not an excuse, but it is a thing I could recognize. I reached into my bag and placed the screenshots of Nadine's texts on the table, alongside the notes from Lily's recording. I said, I am not going to pursue legal action at this time. Franklin's expression indicated he had thoughts about that, but he did not interrupt. I continued. The power of attorney you had prepared will be destroyed. The Raleigh house is mine and will remain mine. Any future communication about my finances or my property will go through Franklin first. Those are not requests. Walter said, I understand. I said, I also need you to understand something else. His eyes met mine. What your father left behind was built for me. Not for emergencies, not for other people's mistakes. For me. It was his way of staying. Walter pressed his hand flat on the table. He nodded. There is a version of this conversation where I would have said more, where I would have laid out every hurt, every phone call that felt obligatory, every Christmas that felt like being tolerated. I had those words. They were right there. But some things don't need saying. Some things are already understood. And I had not come to this table to wound my son. I had come to be seen clearly, and I believe, finally, that I was. I stood, Franklin stood with me. I looked at Walter one last time and said, I love you. I will always love you. And when you are ready to talk about rebuilding something honest between us, I will be there. But that conversation begins with the truth. All of it. I left the hotel conference room and walked through the lobby and out into the cold Atlanta afternoon. And I sat in my car for several minutes, watching people walk past on the sidewalk, going about their ordinary Christmas lives. And I thought about Leonard's saying, the best work is the kind that still stands, long after the person is gone. He had built something that still stood. I was still standing in it. I drove back to Raleigh that afternoon. The roads were quiet. Christmas Day, most people already where they were going. I had the highway largely to myself for long stretches, just the gray sky and the bare winter trees and the road. Somewhere around the South Carolina border, Lily called. She said, Are you going home, Grandma? I am, sweetheart. Is everything going to be okay? I thought about the question honestly. I said, yes, but it's going to look different for a while. She was quiet. Then she said, I'm glad I told you. Me too, baby, me too. 7 months later, I drove back through Raleigh on a Tuesday morning to meet with a realtor. Not to sell the house, to rent it. I had decided to spend a year in the mountains of western North Carolina, a place Leonard and I had talked about for decades, and never quite gotten around to. I found a small house near Asheville, with a porch that faced east and a kitchen, big enough for the kind of cooking that takes all morning and fills the whole house. I took Leonard's fishing rods. I took the photograph of us at our wedding where we are both laughing at something off camera that neither of us can now remember. I took the rum cake recipe written in his mother's handwriting and the yellow legal pad that still had his last grocery list on the first page. I left the burgundy Christmas paper in the closet. I thought I might use it again someday. I was not finished with Christmas. The first few months in Asheville were quieter than I had expected, which is to say they were quieter than I was used to, which is not the same as being too quiet. I walked in the mornings. I cooked elaborate meals for one, and felt no guilt about it. I joined a watercolor class at the community center, taught by a woman named Vera, who had been painting for 50 years, and said that most people didn't start finding their voice until at least the second decade. I liked that. I made friends slowly, the way real friendships form, through proximity and time, and the accumulation of small, honest moments. A retired librarian named Carolee, who walked the same trail every morning. A widower from Knoxville named James, who played chess on Saturday afternoons at the coffee shop near the center of town, and eventually asked if I played, and I said I hadn't in 30 years, and he said, "That's fine, it comes back." It did come back. Walter called in February. The conversation was short and careful and real. In a way, our conversations had not been in some time. He was in counseling. He and Nadine were working through things. He said he was sorry in a way that meant something, because it asked nothing in return. I said I heard him. I said I was glad he called. I said we would take it slowly. We did. By the following Christmas, the one I want to tell you about, as a way of ending this, I hosted a small dinner at the Asheville house. Carolee came, and James from the chess table, and 2 women from my watercolor class, and Lily, who had asked if she could come and spend the week with me, just the 2 of us. We cooked together, Lily and I. She was learning to bake and approached it with the same serious focus she brought to everything. She asked questions. She wrote things down. At one point, she looked up from her notebook and said, "Grandma, how did Grandpa know all the things to do to protect you?" I thought about that. I said, "He paid attention. For 38 years. When you love someone that well, you start to understand what they need even before they do." Lily nodded slowly. She thought about it for a while. Then she said, "I want to love someone like that someday," I said. "You already know how, you've been doing it." She looked at me. Then she smiled and looked back down at her notebook, and wrote something I did not read because some things are private, and I have learned to leave room for that. The table that night was small. The food was good. The laughter was real. Nobody sat somewhere that made them feel forgotten. Nobody performed warmth they did not feel. When the evening wound down, and Carolee and James and the others had gone home, Lily helped me wash the dishes. Carols played from the small speaker near the window. Outside, the mountains were invisible in the dark, but I knew they were there. That's the thing about mountains. You don't always need to see them. I thought about the Christmas Eve one year before, the casserole dish, the folder on the desk, the 47 minutes of silence before anyone called, the hotel room. Leonard's letter. Franklin's briefcase, all of it. And then I thought about this kitchen, this porch, this table I had built from nothing except the decision to stop waiting for someone else to seat me somewhere. Lily handed me the last clean dish and said, "Grandma, this was the best Christmas I've ever had." I put the dish away. I thought about Leonard standing at a kitchen window, on a Sunday morning, unhurried, content, watching the yard. I thought about his voice in the dream. I already handled it. "Stop worrying," I said. "Mine too, sweetheart," and I meant it completely. Not because everything was fixed, not because the past had been rewritten, but because I was exactly where I had chosen to be, surrounded by people who showed up for me the way I had always shown up for everyone else. And the difference between those 2 things was the whole story. It is never too late to understand your own worth. It is never too late to stop waiting at someone else's table and build your own. And if someone you love has already prepared the foundation without telling you, the best thing you can do is trust it and build anyway. If this story reached something in you today, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Have you ever had to walk away from something you loved in order to find something better? Share your story below, and if you are watching from somewhere quiet tonight, know that you are not alone. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.